Morning guys, I'm Dave Canterbury with Self-Reliance Outfitters in the Pathfinder School. What I'd like to do today is just kind of set aside our trapping series that we're working on for the moment and cut a video in here about some developments of flint and steel. And when I say developments, you think to yourself, well, flint and steel is flint and steel. It's been the same since the 8th century. And I disagree with that. I think that there were developments in flint and steel that were probably never documented or recorded, that probably just worked better over time and started to be developed by companies like the Hudson Bay Trading Company to sell fire steels to trappers and frontiersmen and traders along the western frontier. And I believe that those type fire steels are more conducive to the way we use fire steels and the way they used fire steels than the fire steels that were used as strike-a-lights or tinderbox and flint and steel kits that were used in households from 8th, 9th century until probably the 18th century. So let's kind of talk about that for a minute and you'll understand what I mean. I'm going to show you some examples of fire steels first. We're going to talk about tinder boxes and we're going to talk about the differences in the fire steels. And then we're going to take a look at why some fire steels work better than others, given the same heat treat, given that they all have iron content, and understanding that removing that pyrophoric material from the steel with the rock is what oxidizes and causes that spark. And I'm sure that flint and steel has been around since the first implement struck a piece of rock and threw a spark. Somebody had an aha moment and said, hey, look, we can make fire with this. But over time, I believe there were developments, and that is something that I've never heard anyone talk about, and I want to talk about today. Stay with me. Okay, so in front of me here on the ground, I have several fire steels, and I'll put footage of that in this video. I'm also putting pictures throughout this video of historical fire steels from archaeological digs, and I think all of that is very important. So, first of all, I think you'll notice that most of the early fire steels, especially the ones that I'm showing you pictures of in this footage, all had a fairly straight edge on them. And if you look at the pictures that I'm attaching to this video, you'll notice that they all have an indention in them over time where the steel has been worn away in circular fashion, like this, okay? Because if we're striking this thing with a piece of flint, we generally use an arcing motion, just like this, with the piece of flint that we're striking against it, okay? Whether it's arcing this way, or whether it's the steel in our hand, and the steel is arcing, there's always an arc motion with that steel. And what that does is, it creates a wear in a certain pattern on that fire steel over time if it's a straight fire steel. So bear with me on this. If we're using this steel for a strike-a-light box, and a tinder box with flint and steel would have been some type of box very similar to this one that has tinder on one side or charred materials on one side, and a divider in the box to keep your steel and your flint separated from that material so it wasn't damaged during travel or movement. In a household, you would have had the same type thing, and you would have had your flint and steel to light your fires with in your fireplace, to light other things like candles and all those types of things in your house. You would have a flint and steel or tinder box with flint and steel in your house. Now, once people started to travel over distance, they probably did not always have the luxury of having this tinder box, but the steel was easy to carry. So if we're using this with a tinder box, the motion is completely different with our stone that we're using to strike our steel. Because what we're going to do is we're going to hold the steel still, and we're going to strike down on the steel, straight down, just like this, to throw sparks down into a tin. So it's a straight motion down the fire steel. There's no more of this arc, because now we're just trying to throw sparks straight down into a tin. And it's the same thing you do if you use your knife as a fire steel and you're striking straight down the blade, not coming back up, striking straight down to throw sparks into a container. And that could have been any type of container. But once you get to the point where you've decided you're going to do this in the opposite direction, you're going to now pinch your material on top of the rock like you would if you're doing something on the fly, and you had a smaller box that you're using to make your char in, and now it's not as easy to be able to glance sparks into that because it's not a large surface area container. And again, if you're going to use a tinder box, you need something that's fairly large so that you have a lot of surface area covered to throw those sparks into. So the smaller those tinder boxes became to make charred materials in, now it becomes time to put that charred material on top of the stone. It's difficult to do that a lot of times with charred material off the landscape, but it's much easier to do that with charred cloth. And at that point, you're going to go back to that arcing motion on top, just like this. And now you're glancing off the steel, and you're only hitting really in one spot of that steel with a straight edge, okay? So, where's the development? Well, over time, if you look into the 18th century, late 18th century, and early 19th century, companies like the Hudson Bay Company started to make fire steels that were very common along the frontier that were oval or round in shape. And I say roundish, they were more oval shaped. Looked like a chain link almost that was flattened out and then heat treated to become a fire steel that was made of carbon steel. And it would have been much easier for them to make something like this with a straight edge, or even something like this that's more conducive of maybe, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th century stuff like this one. It would have been much easier for them to make this, but again, you have a fairly straight side on this, so you're really only hitting one part of that steel on the rock every time. You're catching either an area from here to here or from here to here, but you're not getting the entire area because you have a straight edge and you're in an arc, okay? And it would have been much easier for them to make something like this than it would be to make a complete oval, because that would have either had to been driven out with some type of a punch or a drift, or it would have had to been forged welded together into circular fashion. So that would have been much more difficult for them to make. However, that was the most common type fire steel along the frontier from the Hudson Bay Trading Company. And I suspect that there's a reason for that, okay? If you look at the frizzen of a flintlock rifle or musket, and I'm going to show you a picture of one here, it is curved so that when the flint comes down on the hammer and strikes that, it follows the curve of that frizzen as it throws it away from the pan, driving more sparks into the pan where your priming powder is before it ignites what's in the barrel. So taking from that, we can deduce that the Hudson Bay Trading Company made a curved fire steel for that reason. And if you look at the fire steel that we sell, the Pathfinder fire tool, it has a curved edge on it, and it happened to work out that way. I'm not claiming I designed this because of some great theory. It happened to work out that way. But I've noticed with this, and this is kind of how I came about all of this, that the more I use this, the better this thing works because of that curvature. Because now, as I strike down, either up or down with this, I have a curved surface that's hitting this flint, and I get more sparks, not because the heat treat's any better necessarily, but because you have more surface area of the steel striking the flint. Now I have a fire steel here that is an actual artifact from the 19th century. Okay, this is actually a fur trade era artifact. And this one is very much curved here instead of straight up and down or flat like this one. You can see the difference in the curvature there of those two. So this one is a little more conducive to coming down and catching more of the steel as you strike, and you're not going to wear that divot into the steel as bad. This one still yet is not as good as something that was more rounded even than this, but this is a very good example of one that was not a complete oval, but one that was curved in the belly. And I think that curvature is the important development in fire steels that we need to understand. So when we're making fire steels or developing fire steels for other people that we want to be the best they can be or work the best that they can work, we want something that's got a curved edge so that as we're striking it and we've got that arced motion with our hand, we're throwing the maximum amount of sparks that we can get off of that piece of material, all right? From here to here. Sparks are being driven from the metal by the material. So we want the most surface area contacting that material here, across here, that we can get. The more sparks, the better our chances are of getting a fire. So now, let's talk about that, okay? If we're using something like a piece of charred cloth, and I've just got a piece of charred t-shirt material here, I can easily place that on top of the sharp edge of my rock and pinch it with my thumb. And now I'm just going to bump that edge up close so that when I strike down on this, the sparks leap over the top and land here. So the more surface area I have contact with in that curvature, the more sparks are going to hit that. Oh, already lit. Okay. So I think that curvature is an advantage because of that. Now, when you're striking into a 10, on the other hand, the curved steel is not going to give you that much of an advantage necessarily, because as you strike down on this, you're going to leave that curvature. If you turn it over this way, you can ride down the curvature a little bit, but you're still going to glance off of it at some point. So this type of steel is much better for the thumb hold method of flint and steel than a straight up and down steel is. And a straight up and down steel is much more conducive to a tinder box. So let's look at that. Okay, again, a tinder box like this was designed to hold and char material, and you could remove the divider. This one happens to be made out of fat wood. Just a piece of fat wood I've cut to length and put it in there. And now I can lay a fire steel and a couple pieces of flint inside that box for easy carry. And this stuff is never going to bump into this and tear it up as I travel, okay? That's the reason for that divider in there. As far as the surface area goes, now let's go back to something like this straight-sided fire steel. And now all we're trying to do really is we're trying to drive sparks straight down the steel and into the box. That's enough sparks that something's on fire in there. Okay, lots of stuff. You can see there's quite a bit of stuff on fire in there. If I don't want to use that stuff right away, all I'm going to do is put a lid on it and put it out, and it'll be fine, okay? But that is the difference between striking into a tin, giving yourself plenty of surface area, and using a straight down motion on the steel, and the curvature of a steel that's going to give you the better ability to bounce sparks on top because you're striking it in an arced fashion. So what does all this really mean? Well, unless you're a fire geek like I am, it probably doesn't mean a whole lot. You can make a flint and steel fire with any steel that you have as long as it has a proper heat treat. All I'm trying to get across is that I think there is developments that have happened within the flint and steel that we've never heard of. It's never been written down, it's never been recorded, and no one's ever talked about it. But I think that steels developed a certain shape on the bottom over time. Now, there were lots and lots of different shapes of fire steel. Some of them were really intricate, some of them not. But the difference between a flat striking surface and an arced or curved striking surface, I think, is the difference in the development and use of that steel. Again, I think the curved steels were more for use with a piece of charred material on top of your stone when you're striking in an arced fashion, just like this. Whereas if you're holding the flint and striking with a rock, you're going straight down into a tinder box. And I think that is the differentiation, and that's why the oval fire steel was so popular with the Hudson Bay Trading Company. So I hope that helps you. I hope it gives you some information you didn't have. I hope it didn't bore you too bad. I appreciate your views. I appreciate your support. I thank you for everything you do for our school, for our family, and for our business, for all of our sponsors, instructors, affiliates, and friends, and I'll be back with another video as soon as I can, guys. Thanks.